Thank you, President Perlange, for the nice introduction, and to the 300th Anniversary Committee for inviting us to present. We're excited to be part of this wonderful series. A couple more thank yous. Okay, thank you also to the Rhode Island Historic Preservation and Heritage Commission and staff for supporting this project as part of Rhode Island Archaeology Month. And finally, thank you to the Public Archaeology Lab, who conducted a lot of the archaeological work that we'll describe today and provided many images. So I'm just going to give a little kind of a brief overview and then turn it over to Rod. So a little bit of this was just discussed, but the idea for this project came up during the 125th anniversary of URI in 2017. There were many wonderful events commemorating this important anniversary, but as archaeologists and historians, we realized that the history of this land was much deeper. So we created a walking tour for Rhode Island Archaeology Month in 2019 and invited Loren Spears, Executive Director of the Tamaqua Museum, to join us to provide an indigenous perspective on the URI campus land. We have copies of the brochure in the lobby if you would like one, and perhaps you could do your own campus tour when there's daylight. Okay, so here we were on that beautiful fall day. We initially focused on the history of the university and especially the Narragansett ties to the land, history invisible to most URI campus community members. We recently created a class which covers this content that I'm teaching now, and aspects are included in various other courses as well. Kathy and Rod will start by going over the traditional history of the URI land. Oops, sorry. And then tell us a little bit about how it started and what those early years were like. We'll then consider who or what is missing from this traditional narrative, who's not represented or remembered in this history. How do we get their stories? Our goal is to get a fuller, more expansive history, which is deeper in time and wider in depth. As we highlight some of these additional stories, we'll draw upon many different ways of knowing, including historical sources, documents, maps, oral histories, archaeological fieldwork and analysis, and indigenous knowledge and oral traditions. Although Loren is not joining our talk today, she started off the 300 speaker series last January, I bet many of you were there, and gave a fantastic talk on traditional lifeways of the Narragansett people. Okay. I'm going to pass it over to Rod.
So the first part of our talk is an overview of the institutional history of URI with a focus on the early years, the land, and the buildings. As an educational institution, URI has had a sequence of 4 names. It started as an agricultural school and an experiment station in 1888. It became the Rhode Island College of Agriculture and Mechanical Arts in 1892. It was renamed again in 1909 as Rhode Island State College, and finally the University of Rhode Island in 1951. The origins of URI date back to the second half of the 19th century, when there was a concerted effort by the United States government to expand American higher education. The government wanted to make higher education more broadly available to Americans of average means, and more practical, particularly for those families who earned a living from farming and working in industry. It did this by providing funds for states to create colleges, specifically to teach agriculture and mechanical arts. Instruction in military science was also included. The funds came from the sale or the granting of federal land to form endowments, 30,000 acres from for each state's member of the House of Representatives, and the same amount for each state's senator. In Rhode Island's case, this amounted to 120,000 acres. Because the colleges were founded on the basis of granting federal land, they became referred to as land-grant colleges, and URI is one of them. In cases where there was insufficient federal land in any particular state, as was the case for Rhode Island and many of the eastern states, those states claimed the rights to land in the new Western territories, in Kansas and Nebraska, Wisconsin, Michigan, and others, and sold it to create endowments. And we'll return to the consequences of all this for indigenous people in a little while. The whole scheme was the brainchild of Vermont Senator Justin Morrill, and so the Act of Congress in 1862 that created these new colleges bears his name. It's called the Morrill Act. There was a second Morrill Act in 1890, and between them, an act that was supposed to support the creation of agricultural research stations, called the Hatch Act in 1887. Together, these three acts provided the funds for what would become URI. But it was not straightforward. Rhode Island accepted the funds for the Morrill Act and passed responsibility for an agriculture and mechanical arts program to Brown University. But many folks in the farming community were dissatisfied with the results, and when Congress passed the Hatch Act in 1887, which allocated funds for agriculture experiment stations, they lobbied through their Grange organizations for a school and experiment station that was separate from Brown. And they got their way. The Rhode Island General Assembly authorized the money from the Hatch Act to be used to help purchase the 140-acre Oliver Watson farm in Kingston and set up an agricultural school and research station. Local South Kingstown citizens, including the Kingston postmaster, Vernon Helm, as well as Jeremiah Peckham and Thomas Hazard, helped to make it happen. In 1890, Congress passed the second Morrill Act, which granted an annual federal appropriation to support agricultural schools. This set up a showdown between those who wanted the new money to go to Brown, which would then subsume the Kingston experiment station, and those who wanted the new money to go to the agricultural school and experiment station in Kingston and help build it into a fully fledged independent college. After a lot of wrangling and a ruling from the Rhode Island Supreme Court, which actually favored Brown, the independent college in Kingston plan won the day. On the 19th of May, 1892, the Rhode Island General Assembly passed legislation that created the Rhode Island College of Agricultural and Mechanical Arts. On the evening that the Rhode Island General Assembly created the Rhode Island A&M, students at the experiment station in Kingston celebrated. They started to ring bells and raise flags, and having secured a Civil War cannon from a shady, convicted murderer in Kingston called Captain George Ed Kenyon, they started to fire it off. The cannon was named after Kenyon's friend and local political leader, Benjamin F. Butler, hence the name Old Ben Butler. And eventually the students packed the gun so tightly with grass and sodden leaves that they exceeded the tensile strength of the gun and blew it up, leaving it in its current condition. Today, many faculty members and staff and students see the cannon, and only a few really understand what it commemorates. Before we go on to talking about the new college, we need to reflect on the consequences of this land grant structure. During the 19th century, the US moved aggressively westward, subsuming at least 2 million square miles of land owned by Native Americans. The mechanisms for doing so were termed purchase and treaty, but invariably they were backed by violence, conquest, removal, appropriation, confiscation, and abjuration. When Brown was trying to raise money for the initial endowment, it attempted to claim land formerly owned by the Kickapoo in northeast Kansas. The tribe had been dispossessed of that land in 1825. Brown's claim eventually failed because a railroad company, the Atchison and Pikes Peak Railroad, also coveted the land. Ultimately, the Morrill Act endowment for Brown, and by extension for URI, came from claiming and selling 891 plots, each averaging around about 160 acres, in 8 different states. The land was taken from indigenous peoples in 18 separate actions and transactions in the 19th century. And the data that you see there is fresh off the press from one of our graduate students, Jenny Sullivan. This is part of the land acquired and sold in Kansas. But there was also, of course, another level of dispossession. The land upon which URI sits is the ancestral Narragansett Neantic land. And it was taken in a process that started in the 17th century. The undermining and attempted erasure of local tribes continued in southern Rhode Island as the fledgling agriculture and experiment station was coming into existence. In the early 1880s, the state of Rhode Island detribalized the Narragansett, and the broadside that you see here from 1882 advertised the selling off of tribal reservation land. In 1888, the 140-acre Oliver Watson farm on Narragansett ancestral land became Rhode Island State Agricultural School and Experiment Station. And it's shaded in green here on the map. And although URI has expanded significantly since then, we can still see the original boundaries marked in the landscape. If you were to stand here on Plains Road, you can still see this line of trees that marks the original boundary, or one part of the original boundary. And if you stand here, marked by the second red arrow, and look down West Alumni Avenue, you can see another boundary, marked by the telephone poles on the right-hand side. This is an original water supply map for the college. It has some new buildings in the center right, but also some of the original farm buildings. One of these on the map, the Oliver Watson House, is marked by the red circle there. I hope you can see it. And it's often claimed that it's the only surviving structure from the farm. And here's the house as it looks today. But there was, however, another building on this map that still exists today, and it's marked by the second red circle there on the left. At the time it was a barn, and today it's a storage facility on the URI campus. Incidentally, if you've ever wondered why the football stadium is orientated northwest, southeast, it's so that it would fit within the original land plot and was built upon an earlier sports field and running track. The first new building was Taft Hall, built in 1889. It was a lab building named after Governor Royal Taft. The granite used for the original campus buildings was quarried on site, and one quarry was close to what today is called Quarry Road, near Hillside Dawn. The second new building was called College Hall, and here folks are working on its construction in 1890. When it was complete, it looked like this, and it housed the university's first library. The third building, seen here on the right, was South Hall, and we don't know whether it was really an existing structure or whether it was newly built. It's something of a mystery to us, and we've been debating it even up to this afternoon. In the first decades, these buildings along the western edge of the current quad were orientated to the west, looking downhill. There was a fire in January of 1895 that destroyed College Hall. Luckily, there was no loss of life. Most of the students were in the village of Kingston in church services. This is the western face of the building after the fire. Davis Hall, named for Governor Davis, was quickly built from the ruins. This is Davis under construction and South Hall on the right. The first principal and subsequent president of the State Agricultural School was John Washburn, and he decided to change the orientation and focus of the academic buildings. He hired the famous architects, landscape architects, the Olmsted brothers, best known for designing Central Park in New York, to lay out what would become the University Quad. The original three buildings, seen here inside the red square, were orientated, as I said, downhill towards the bottom of the screen. But the Olmsted brothers designed a quad that you see here on the plan, orientating the university in the other direction. Only the left-hand side was built as designed. Interestingly, the chapel there up in the center is the same shape as Edwards Auditorium, which was built in the same location in 1928. Also note here at the top, there's an area designated for sites for university professors' housing. We've been waiting a while, Professor. Here we see South, Davis, and Taft, and a new building, Lippett, being constructed. It was completed in 1897. Oops, that's that. There, I'm sorry. And this is the northwest corner of the quad once Lippett was completed. East in 1909, Ranger in 1914, Washburn in 1920, and Bliss in 1928 filled in the perimeter of the current quadrangle. Washburn was originally called Aggie Hall, and Ranger was originally called Science Hall. Edwards was also completed in 1928. For the first time, funding for a building on campus came from a state bond issue. Rodman was also completed in 1928 as a gymnasium and an armory. During construction, they ran out of granite, and hence the strange mixture of materials and design. In this schematic from the 1940s, additional buildings include Green and Quinn and Roosevelt halls, which were all completed in the 1930s. Roosevelt was the first brick building on campus and was built in honor of First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. Roosevelt, together with Green and Quinn, were built as part of a large state and federal jobs program during the Great Depression. It's interesting to compare the college in 1923 with the college in 1936. Here it is in 1923, and you can see that Edwards and Bliss are missing. And here it is in 1936. Both of those have been built, and also the foundations for Green have been laid. Not surprisingly, the campus was deeply impacted by World War II. Officer military training was present on campus. Enrollment declined as people were away during the war, and despite the images on screen, the majority of undergraduates during this time were women. The campus grew tremendously after the war. The GI Bill greatly increased enrollments. To handle the rapid growth of the university, new buildings were constructed in the 1960s and 70s, mostly using a combination of state bonds and federal monies. Some were named after politicians like Pastori and Fogarty, Chafee, Morrill and Pell. Others were named for university leaders, for example, Carlotti and Ballantyne, Kirk, Keeney, Swan, White, Tucker and Carruthers. The Justin S. Morrill Science Building, which was opened in 1966, recognizes the land-grant origin of the university. Starting in the 1990s, new construction projects were added to the campus supporting university missions. Naming trends on buildings shifted during this time period from Rhode Island politicians and leaders to financial benefactors and influential alumni, including Beaupre, Pascatelli, and Ryan. So over time, university leaders, Rhode Island politicians, and benefactors have been memorialized in the URI cultural landscape.
Thank you, Rod. So clearly, if we look at this screen, some people are represented and some people are not. There's a specific demographic, okay, I'm short. There's a specific demographic represented here, of course, tied to gender and race. Today, a few women are commemorated in the landscape of the URI campus. The first building dedicated to a woman was, of course, Eleanor Roosevelt Hall in 1938. Most of the buildings named for women are lower profile buildings, places, and they include residence halls, centers, and an auditorium. The first academic building named for a woman was Whitehall in 1977, and it's the home, of course, of the College of Nursing. And in 2008, Independence Hall was renamed Swan Hall in honor of the provost, Beverly Swan, for her years of dedicated service. So let's consider gendered spaces here on the campus. And although women are underrepresented in the built landscape today, they have always been present. In the late 19th century, 2 women representing the Watson and the Teft families deeded the farm to the state of Rhode Island. This institution was co-educational from the very start, and tuition actually was free for Rhode Island residents in the very beginning. Women were represented among the faculty and the staff also, but their numbers were very small in the initial years. There were very different rules for men and women students residing on campus, with much stricter rules for young women in terms of curfews, in terms of clothing, in terms of rules of appropriate behavior. One example here. In 1966, the president of URI, Francis Horn, wrote to Evelyn Morris, who was the dean of women at the time, and he expressed concern over a female student wearing curlers in her hair to lecture. And he explained, and I quote, "I get extremely irritated at young women who have this habit of appearing in public with their hair this way. Is there anything we can do to prevent this sort of thing?" Horn actually is going to retire the following year, in 1967, just in time before the turmoil of the late 1960s into the 1970s. Although a few women pursued science degrees at the university, most women were clustered in defined majors: home economics, nursing, and of course education. Home economics was first established as a major in 1907. These gendered traditions continued until the 1970s, when the College of Home Economics was actually reorganized at that point in time. Oops, I think I went too fast. Okay. Over the years, the Watson House, which is located geographically in the center of campus, served many purposes, but most were connected to women at the university and home economics. So it served as a women's dormitory. It was a nursery school for a number of years. It also, in the 1930s, was a tea room, an attractive tea room, which served as a laboratory for the home economics majors. Oops, going too fast. Okay. The liberal arts curriculum was actually fundamental to the establishment of the Bachelor of Arts degree, which was crucial for the transformation of Rhode Island State College to the University of Rhode Island. In 1951, the School of Arts and Sciences became the College of Arts and Sciences, and the college grew very quickly and became the largest at the university. And this is standing, it holds to this very day. Arts and Sciences is the foundation upon which the university was built, and over the past 75 years, this is the anniversary year, the college has led the university in supporting academics, programs, and cutting-edge research. The enrollment of women increased significantly in the 1950s, and many were attracted to the new Bachelor of Arts degree in the College of Arts and Sciences. So the first BA degree actually was awarded to a woman. Her name was Thelma Allen, here on your screen, in the class of 1949. In the post-war years, the campus struggled to accommodate the rapid increase in the numbers of students. The GI Bill and the baby boom were a part of this reason. And gendered inequities persisted, and they were glaringly apparent, especially in these post-war years. In 1952, Dean Morris, there again, she called attention to the inadequate housing conditions for female students at the university. In a very long and detailed letter, she itemized the problems, which included heating and rats and things of that nature. Obsolete, inadequate, and overcrowded is how she phrased her opening statement. Many students were housed in those old Quonset huts that were left over from the war. The 1960s was a transitional time for women in the United States and at URI. A special thanks to the URI Women's Leadership Council here and the founding members from the class of 1970, Janice DiLorenzo, Marilyn Zatirian, and Victoria Cataldo. They started a research project a number of years ago on women at URI with a short documentary that they edited and put together. It was entitled Her Story. You can look it up online. And a special shout out here to all the alumni that helped with our Gendered Spaces oral history project that happened last year. Some of those that were young women, they helped us out as alum. Young women in the 1970s were a part of second wave feminism. They advocated for equality and sexual freedom. 1970 was a particularly volatile year on campus. Female students and faculty demanded a revised curriculum, and new courses in women's studies were eventually approved. Female faculty fought for equal recognition and equal pay in a class action lawsuit against the university, and they won in the early 1980s. This tradition of female activism, engagement, and leadership at URI continues to this very day. But as a group, women are largely invisible in the built landscape around campus. In addition to women, trying to switch gears a little bit, also lacking in the campus landscape is a recognition of its early plantation history. Euro-Americans settling in this location give us an opportunity to think about the impact of colonization. In the mid-17th century, Euro-Americans families took over a large tract of land extending from present-day North Kingstown all the way down to Narragansett. This was called the Petasquamsket Purchase. It wasn't really a purchase. The English brought with them the understanding of individual property ownership. This understanding of land ownership and land use was very different from the indigenous perspective. The land itself became a commodity and a source of wealth, something that was going to be fought over. South Kingstown was a battleground during King Philip's War in 1675 and 1676. The outbreak of war was the result of aggressive and contentious settlement patterns and the outright theft of indigenous land. South Kingstown was the location of the Great Swamp Massacre in December of 1675. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 500 and 1,000 Narragansett people, mostly women and children, were shot or burned alive in what can only be described today as a war crime. The English used religion to justify their actions of total warfare, genocide, and slavery. In the 17th century, Euro-American families in South Kingstown created an elite society for themselves. They were called the Narragansett Planters, and their farms were called plantations. Oops. On these fertile lands, the planters grew crops, raised livestock for sustenance and export. One example here is the Narragansett Pacer, which is a type of horse. This remained a profitable export well into the 19th century. European colonists used servants and enslaved people of both indigenous and African descent in much higher numbers in South Kingstown compared with all other parts of Rhode Island except Newport. South Kingstown was the epicenter of plantation slavery in Rhode Island, and Rhode Island was the center of slavery and the slave trade in New England. In 1775, the land upon which the URI campus sits was a plantation owned by the Niles family. Silas Niles II controlled 10 indigenous enslaved people and 6 enslaved people of African descent. Note this number was much higher than his grandfather in terms of the generations. Later on, we're going to return to the Niles family because their burial ground is still located on the campus. Historical text like this one, this is an extract from the Nathaniel Niles' will. This humanizes the past and tells us the names of many of the enslaved people that were actually owned by Nathaniel Niles. In South Kingstown and Rhode Island, the business of slavery continued well into the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Rhode Island eventually passed a gradual emancipation law, but slavery is going to persist. In the 19th century, agriculture, farming continued as the economic base for South County. South Kingstown families continued to farm throughout the 19th century. They continued to grow crops, raise livestock, including chickens and sheep and cows, but it was increasingly difficult to do so for families to make a living on the land. Poverty was on the rise, and a lot of young people were actually moving to the cities for more economic opportunities. In this context is the origin of Rhode Island A&M. The government wanted to make higher education more broadly available to Americans of average means and more practical, particularly for those families who earned a living from farming or working in industry. The federal government's promotion of farming as a science within the mission of the land-grant college was an effort to make farming more productive once again.
Okay, we're on the home stretch. Okay, so the early plantation history is very interesting, and historical sources provide a lot of information, but also reveal gaps in our knowledge. So archaeology can help bridge some of those gaps. So I'm going to kind of close by talking about some of the archaeology on campus. There's 2 places that connect with early plantation history: the Niles Burial Ground and the Watson House. The Niles Burial Ground is located near the present-day football stadium. The cemetery contains the remains of the Niles family. It might also be the resting place for Black and Indigenous people. They were certainly buried on campus land, but there were also other cemeteries on the farm. The burial ground, which is a 1/4 acre in size, is grass-covered and enclosed by a gray fieldstone wall. It's located on the south side of the Bryan Center. You can see it in the bottom left there. There's a wooden gate in the southwest corner and a plaque that is supposed to convey some of the cemetery's historic significance. The cemetery was known at the time the state acquired the land for URI in 1888. The red circle shows the location of the Niles burial ground. However, that knowledge faded over the subsequent 100 years, and the cemetery became invisible in the landscape. So it was a surprise to workers digging a trench to wire the scoreboard at the south end of the Meade Stadium in August 1986 when they uncovered the skeletal remains of 3 people. Preliminary investigations re-identified the cemetery, and analysis of the bones suggested these particular burials were people of European descent. Just over a decade later, in 1999, construction of the Ryan Center and improvements to the football field threatened to disturb the graves once more. So the university called in archaeologists from the Public Archaeology Lab in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, to determine the location of unmarked graves within the burial ground. Just a little bit about archaeology. Archaeology is one way of knowing about the past. We systematically locate objects, record their context, and analyze them. And the power of archaeology is in providing information about people and activities that are often left out of written records. The objects we recover are tangible reminders of the people who once lived here. At the Nile Cemetery, the archaeologists did not excavate. Rather, they shovel-skimmed the ground to expose the tops of 36 suspected grave shafts, which were oriented east to west, shown here in red. The work was not designed to expose human remains, just determine where the graves were located. The Nile's burial ground is both visible and invisible today. While thousands of people pass by the burial plot each year, few know what it represents. Even fewer stop to think and reflect. The small plaque embedded outside the west wall remains largely invisible to passers-by. It's fair to say the plaque fails to acknowledge the full context of the burial ground and the historical processes in play. Another feature on the landscape is the Oliver Watson farmhouse, which you've already heard a little bit about. This is one of two standing buildings that predate the establishment of URI. The house you see today was built in 1796 by Jeremiah Carpenter, a tenant farmer. It sits atop an earlier 18th century house belonging to the Niles family. In fact, the older 18th century foundation is still visible on the west side of the house. Although we don't know for sure whether enslaved peoples lived at the current Watson farmhouse, they certainly worked the land in the 18th century. Over the years, the house and lands were sold several times. Oliver Watson purchased the property in 1844. The family held it until 1888 when Watson heirs Mary Tefft and Phoebe Watson sold the land to the state of Rhode Island for what would become URI. Like the Niles burial ground, the Watson house is both visible and invisible. Thousands pass by it every day, but few members of our community consider what it represents. Archaeology has made the Watson house a little more visible. Retired professor of anthropology Bill Turnbaugh and his students conducted surface collection and small-scale excavations in the Watson house yard in the 1970s and early 1980s. The primary goal was to train his students in field and laboratory methods. So you see him with some of his students here. Bricks, glass, broken dishes, nails, and ash were commonly recovered. Personal items found included 2 cast iron toys, ceramic pipe stems, beads, a marble, a decorative pewter plaque, a gilded stick pen head, and a penny. The archaeology students sorted and cataloged the ceramic pottery types, which included earthenware, stoneware, pearlware, and porcelain, which were decorated in a variety of ways. Most of the ceramics were of 19th century origin, but a small number dated to the 18th century. And these are all in the URI library today. Quartz projectile points were also found in the excavation units, testifying to the presence of Narragansett peoples occupying the same location at an earlier time. While few people stop to consider the Watson house, fewer still are aware of the Spring house, the remains of which are 200 yards down the road from the Watson house, close to the Roger Williams dorm complex. The structure is mostly buried, just the top is exposed. So depending on the time of year, whether they've cut the weeds or not, it's a little easier or harder to see. In the 19th century, the Spring house was part of the farm. Its function was to provide easy access to the groundwater. People drew water from a stone-lined internal basin or sink. The structure itself provided protection from outside contaminants. In this picture from the 1880s, there's a seated woman visible, which gives us an indication of the original height of the structure, perhaps 6 feet. It was constructed of local fieldstone and is integrated into an adjacent stone retaining wall. Okay. So finally, we consider the ancestral Narragansett lands. After 400 years of colonial occupation, the Narragansett are largely invisible on the landscape. Near the library on campus, there's a large stone monolith. It's the only visible acknowledgement on the main campus of the Narragansett people. Carved into the stone monolith is Nipinawantawem, meaning, I am of another language. Remember me, remember me. Archaeology and indigenous oral traditions both provide insights into earlier time periods without written records and help to make the Narragansett ties to the land more visible. Before I talk a little bit about that earlier history, it's helpful to envision what it looked like prior to European contact. Many portions of the upper campus were very rocky prior to the establishment of the university. You can see these rocks in the 1889 photo of the Watson House. So one of the things that the students did early on was help remove those rocks. I think it was part of their practicum. However, the area at the base of the hill near the Plains Road parking lot is a sandy outwash plain with well-drained soils and fewer rocks, which is well suited for farming. Before the construction of the URI campus, two healthy streams ran across this land, Whitehorn Creek and Whitehorn Brook, which can be seen in this 1942 topographic map. One branch of the brook feeds into the Chipauxet River. Here's the image again with the waterways highlighted. Given the fertile soil and waterways, it's not surprising that ancestral Narragansett objects are most abundant in these low-lying areas. This area would have been wooded prior to European contact and would have been an ideal place for foraging. We know that indigenous people were a permanent presence on this landscape. Bill Turnbaugh also conducted archaeological work on other areas of campus in the 1970s. Here you can see a portion of his annotated survey map. More recently, the Public Archaeology Lab was hired to investigate this area prior to various construction projects, such as the Plains Road parking lot shown here. Pale archaeologists used a backhoe to strip off the disturbed topsoil and carefully scrape the surface to reveal features such as pits or hearths. So, what was found here? Many objects were located near the ground surface, including white quartz and green argillite flakes, waste material produced when making chipstone tools. See in the bottom right. As well as the tools themselves, of course, including projectile points, scrapers, and knives. The argillite likely originated from a source on Connecticut Island, present-day Jamestown in Narragansett Bay. In contrast, the quartz tools were likely made from cobbles locally available in stream beds and in much of the area's soils. Most of the flakes were less than 1 centimeter in size, which indicates that people initially manufactured the tools elsewhere, but finished or resharpened them here. In addition, many features were excavated. These have been truncated by centuries of plowing so that only the very bottoms were still intact. Here you can see one of those features before and during excavation. This particular one contained charcoal and chipping debris. Many of the features excavated by Pale contained abundant charcoal or burnt wood. They hypothesized that some of the identified features were used for the slow cooking of foods, hide smoking, and or smudge pits to repel insects. One hearth feature excavated by Turnbaugh contained fire-cracked rocks, approximately 100 large and small quartz flakes, 2 projectile points, small mammal bone fragments, and carbonized nutshells, including hickory. Because Turnbaugh recovered hickory nuts, he felt the site was used in the fall months. Radiocarbon dating and artifact style indicate that this area was most heavily occupied between 3,000 to 5,000 years ago, although there's evidence for more recent use as well. Archaeology helps to make this visible. Interestingly, the archaeological evidence supports what the Narragansett people already knew. There are oral traditions telling of a village located on or near campus. In recent years, there's been more efforts to combine the science of archaeology with traditional indigenous knowledge, including oral traditions, cultural practices, language, music, and dance. Combining the two provides a fuller understanding of the past. For example, archaeology can tell us what people ate in the past, but tells us little about the meaning or spiritual importance of those animals or plants that were eaten. Indigenous knowledge gives insights into cultural beliefs associated with hunting or gathering, such as the corn planting moon ceremony shown on the right. For archaeologists, the objects we find are artifacts. For indigenous people, they're called cultural belongings, tangible reminders of their ancestors who lived and worked on this land. Today, the remains of the ancestral Narragansett sites are invisible to the URI community, but the Narragansett people are still here, living and working on this land. So just wanted to end with a plug for the Tamaquag Museum. You can learn more about indigenous culture at the many events that they have. And there are plans underway for the museum to move to a site on the URI campus, which will allow more students and visitors to learn about their culture. So thank you very much. Thanks to all these people that helped with the project along the way.